Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Real Ambassadors. Dave and Iola Brubeck and Louis Armstrong Challenged Segregation. By Keith Hatschek. Narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Prejudice is indescribable. To me, it is the reason we could lose the world. I have been through Asia and India and the Middle East, and we have to realize how many brown-skinned people there are in this world. Prejudice here or in South Africa is setting up our world for one terrible letdown. Dave Brubeck, in Ralph J. Gleason, You Can't Play Here. San Francisco Chronicle, September 21st, 1958. Forward. Serendipity. It entered my life when, at the age of 16, I left my home in Sri Lanka and traveled by myself to Melbourne, Australia. When I look back, I realize how apt the word is. Serendib was the name given to Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, by Arab travelers in the 1600s when they survived a major storm and landed on the island. The name means fortuitous happening. In Australia, I met the great Dixieland jazz musician Graham Bell, who became my manager. It was the beginning of my singing career. At a party given for Louis Armstrong's band performing in Melbourne, Graham introduced me briefly to Mr. Armstrong. I was wearing my long hair in plaits. At age 26, when I attended a rehearsal for the premiere of The Real Ambassadors, to be performed at Monterey Jazz Festival, September 1962, Louis turned to his wife and said, "Mama, I know that girl." He remembered my plaits. Serendipity? But the greatest serendipity of all was how I came to be a part of Lambert, Hendricks, and Bevan. Living in London during the late 50s and early 60s, I befriended several jazz musicians who would invite me to ride along in the coaches they took to their performances. I had the good fortune to meet Dave Brubeck on one of these rides. He asked me to meet him at his hotel, as he had some music he wanted me to look at. "Can you sight read this?" he asked, pointing at the top stave. Being quite young, I was not immobilized by fears or ego. I had faith in divine source. I sang. "What is this music for?" I asked. "A jazz opera called The Real Ambassadors," he answered. "The part I had you sight read is written for Annie Ross." I was not very familiar with Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. I continued working as an actress. My close friends Don and Sandra Luck hosted great parties and invited touring musicians. At one such party, I was helping empty ashtrays while a Dizzy Gillespie album was playing. Without thinking, I sang the final note, and a voice next to me asked, "Did you just hit that high note? Are you a singer?" I answered, "No, I am an actress." The person asking me was Dave Lambert, whom I did not know. That was April 1962. 2 weeks after the Basie Band, John and Dave, minus Annie, returned to New York, I received a phone call from John Hendricks, whom I also did not know. He invited me to New York to sing with them. I giggled and said I could not because I was not a singer and not capable of singing their style of music and certainly could not hit high notes. His call came on May 1st. He said they had arranged a plane ticket, visa, and working permit at the U.S. Embassy, and they wanted me there on May 3rd. I declined, saying I could not come until May 5th. 4 months later, I was performing in the premiere of The Real Ambassadors at the Monterey Jazz Festival. Serendipity? Jazz shone a beacon of magical light on my life. I remained in the U.S. and was surprised and dismayed that jazz, America's music, and its creators were treated like second-class citizens. Racism bearing its fangs. Of course, racism is not only in the United States. When, at 16, I prepared to go to Australia, I had to prove I had 60% white blood before I could go, according to Australia's immigration law. Luckily, my mom took me to the Dutch Burger Club where the records showed I had the desired amount. The fangs are global. I am honored to write this foreword. Keith has done extensive research, and his words show such love, patience, and dedication. In this book, he shares the truth and joy of the real ambassadors, created by Iola, Dave, and Lewis, with whom I was blessed to share the stage. 50 years later, I was part of the Real Ambassadors concert at Lincoln Center, celebrating Dave Brubeck. Serendipity. Yolande Pavan. Prologue. On the evening of September 23, 1962, as civil rights momentum was escalating to a fervor, a cast of 13 talented artists came together at the Monterey Jazz Festival to perform The Real Ambassadors, a jazz musical challenging racial inequality. The culmination of 5 years' work, the musical was written by well-known jazz musician Dave Brubeck and his wife, Iola, expressly to feature the most celebrated jazz musician in the world, Louis Armstrong. That night, they performed a slimmed-down, one-hour concert version of what was envisioned as a 3-act Broadway show, and their hope was that this premiere would help make that full production dream a reality. Supporting players included Carmen McRae, the vocal trio Lambert, Hendricks, and Bevan, and Armstrong's all-star band, along with Dave Brubeck, Eugene Wright, and Joe Morello. Iola Brubeck, who wrote the book and co-wrote the lyrics for her husband's songs, provided narration from a separate temporary stage to frame the musical numbers and explain the show's themes. The musical was inspired in part by the U.S. State Department and its Cultural Ambassadors program, which had been sending American jazz musicians abroad beginning with Dizzy Gillespie's 1956 tour. These jazz ambassadors toured overseas as a form of cultural diplomacy, promoting jazz as a uniquely American art form and touting it as a product of a free society. The Brubecks' Real Ambassadors offered a nuanced portrait of these jazz ambassadors, drawing heavily on the experiences the couple had during their own State Department-sponsored global tour in 1958. Selling the notions of freedom and equality abroad was intended to present a contrast to the opposing totalitarian model offered by the Soviet Union. Ironically, however, while America's black jazz ambassadors were treated as royalty abroad, they still suffered racial prejudice at home on a daily basis. The Real Ambassadors told the story of this irony, chronicling the hard road traveled by jazz musicians on tour for Uncle Sam in the 1950s. Led by a charismatic trumpeter and vocalist, Pops and his love interest, the band's vivacious female singer, Rhonda, the show's lyrics and dialogue made plain the Brubecks' belief that segregation must be overturned and that the artists should take a stand to work toward social justice. The Real Ambassadors tackled controversial themes head-on, and some of its concepts could be considered blasphemous at the time. For example, posing the question, could God be black? In one of the musical's most memorable songs, and dreaming aloud of a time when integrated music groups might be able to perform in Mississippi. Historian Penny Von Eschen argued that bringing the show to the stage at the height of the civil rights movement was not without risk. She stated, "From our present-day perspective, these types of statements defending civil rights and egalitarianism seem relatively mild, but when this was produced, America was at the height of the violent civil rights movement, and the federal government had not yet begun to take a stand to defend civil rights advocacy on a formal level. It was a very bold, controversial act at that moment in time." In evidence reconstructing the musical's rocky path to the stage, we see that music industry power players such as Columbia Records president Goddard Lieberson warned the Brubecks to avoid such controversy if Dave and Iola wanted to see the musical realized. In the early 1960s, the battle over civil rights in the United States was front and center on nightly newscasts, and the musical and its message were perfectly attuned to the national debate. At the time, powerful governmental, economic, fraternal, and institutional groups in the U.S. were aligned to prevent the end of racial segregation by working actively to sustain the centuries-old practices of Jim Crow, ingrained practices that restricted the civil and societal rights of black Americans and relegated them to second-class status. Even though the landmark 1954 decision reached and Brown v. Board of Education outlawed school segregation, local leaders scoffed at the law and maintained strict segregation throughout society, most prominently in the South. Powerful leaders such as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Medgar Evers and Dr. Ralph Abernathy, and organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, had raised their voices and were taking action to demand an end to segregation. Nonviolent actions including marches, boycotts, sit-ins, and teach-ins led by ministers, students, and activists were reported regularly in the media, especially when such peaceful acts caused violent responses from those strongly opposed to breaking the grip of Jim Crow. The nation was undergoing a crisis of unprecedented scope. Within 12 months of the show's debut, the tragic evidence of a nation divided would be apparent in the whole world. Only a few days after the show's 1962 premiere, James Meredith enrolled to attend the University of Mississippi, the first African-American student to do so. This led to riots that left 3 persons dead, 6 policemen shot, and dozens injured on the campus. A few months later, in May 1963, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference rallied students of all ages to march peacefully in protest to downtown Birmingham, Alabama, where the notorious Commissioner of Public Safety, Bull Connor, ordered fire hoses used on the children, knocking many off their feet and shredding their clothes. This inhumanity was documented everywhere, from major networks' nightly newscasts to the front page of the New York Times, where on May 4th, an iconic photo spread showed a black high school student, Walter Gadsden, being attacked by Connor's police dogs. 4 months later, on Sunday, September 15, 1963, the murder of 4 young girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing further stunned the nation. News coverage of the protests dominated every form of media, and every day, Americans were reminded of the sacrifices being made by citizens of color. Given this context, it is no surprise that the real ambassador's road to the stage was neither straightforward nor simple, spanning 5 years of the lives of Dave and Iola Brubeck, the creators and evangelists who were determined to bring the show to life. As Dave Brubeck's own music career blossomed, he made his position on civil rights a cornerstone of his identity, both as an artist and an American. He was quoted frequently in interviews with a courageous mantra, that society would benefit from becoming colorblind. His ideals had come from observing how his father, Pete Brubeck, managed the large ranch in California's Central Valley where the family lived in the 1930s. His father treated everyone with respect, hiring ranch hands who were white, Mexican, and Native American. The young Brubeck worked summers and after school as a ranch hand, side by side with these men, while attending the local public school in Ione, California, where he had a number of friends who were Native American. The pianist's humanistic values advanced through his subsequent experiences as a young GI leading what was likely the first integrated U.S. Army band, the Wolfpack, during World War II. After the war, Brubeck hired African-American bassist Wyatt Bull Ruther as a member of the Dave Brubeck Quartet in 1951-52. In 1958, another black bassist, Eugene Wright, became a mainstay of the quartet. Due to Jim Crow restrictions on integrated bands performing in the South, the Dave Brubeck Quartet had to cancel 22 dates of a 1960s Southern College campus tour. Brubeck refused to replace Wright with a white bassist, losing an estimated $40,000 in income. Having witnessed firsthand the sting of discrimination through his many musical friends and colleagues, Brubeck and his wife developed a deep-seated commitment to equal rights for all. The Brubecks used their wits and resources to enlist the aid of every like-minded show business contact they had in order to make the real ambassadors a reality. Still, the performance itself was nearly torpedoed in the weeks leading up to the festival by Armstrong's manager, Joe Glazer, a powerful man who saw much to lose and little to gain from such an endeavor. Likewise, Armstrong's own wife, Lucille, feared that tackling difficult new songs might have been beyond her husband's reach at that time, as he had suffered a near-fatal heart attack in 1959 while on the road in Italy and was weakened by 40 years of non-stop touring. The night of the premiere belonged to the cast. At its conclusion, one critic noted that the performers were rewarded with a standing ovation by 5,000 fans. Everyone applauded, Some wept. Critics unanimously praised the work as a bold statement supporting equal rights, telling the story of African American musicians with dignity and sensitivity in a way that deserved national attention. With these endorsements ringing in their ears, the Brubecks' 5-year effort to bring the full production to Broadway or television felt within reach. But the growing success of the Dave Brubeck Quartet, which came to be the most popular small jazz ensemble in the world, eclipsed the Real Ambassadors until it re-emerged in the 1990s as a vital, if overlooked, piece of Brubecks and Armstrong's careers. In the 21st century, it has enjoyed 3 revivals, which have proven that the timeless messages in it still ring true today. Documenting a largely untold history of black and white jazz artists teaming up to challenge Jim Crow, with Cold War tensions and the emerging civil rights movement as a backdrop, the tale of the Real Ambassadors is a story within a story. Wrapped around the production's fictional plot was a very real account of struggle in the civil rights era, as Louis Armstrong and Dave and Iola Brubeck fought to present a musical designed to foment social change. Understanding its complicated road to the stage against the backdrop of its underlying message can provide insight today, at a time when race relations are once again at the forefront of national discourse. These talented artists demonstrated that challenging racism, xenophobia, gender bias, and other hate-based creeds requires logic, compassion, wit, and above all, dogged persistence, and that the reward may come in unexpected forms and on unexpected timelines. Dave and Iola Brubeck and the cast of the Real Ambassadors collectively made a bold social and political statement at a time when many Americans were angry, confused, and in search of answers, lifting their voices to help bring about social change one song at a time. They can be seen as a part of a wave of mid-20th century American musicians, filmmakers, and artists who spoke out loudly against discrimination in direct response to their troubled times. This story illustrates the vital role that artists can play as ambassadors of the truth, speaking for equality and justice, both in their own time and through their art, for all times. It demonstrates the importance of keeping our eyes on the prize, even if we may never see that prize fully realized in our own lifetime. Chapter 1. Meet the Brubecks. The original idea to create a jazz musical was conceived by Iola Whitlock Brubeck in 1956. She had been married to David Warren Brubeck, her college sweetheart, for 14 years. His star was rising as one of the most celebrated jazz pianists and small ensemble leaders of his time, while she simultaneously managed Dave's career and a family of 7 in their busy Oakland, California household. Iola had been involved in theater, drama, and broadcasting through the formative years of high school and college, starting at Shasta High in Redding, California, through her many stage and radio performances at College of the Pacific in Stockton, California. Her early performance career peaked when, through a radio contest, she won a speaking role in the cast of the nationally syndicated melodrama Red Ryder. Iola continued to develop her artistic voice, studying creative writing at Mills College in Oakland. She published 2 short stories in Pacific, Mills College's literary review. The Tiger Kite, published in 1947, tells the story of a young black boy, Manny, growing up in a predominantly white small town. His grandfather helps him to make a white kite with a fierce tiger's face painted on it, a symbol of the freedom that he and his family long for in the restrictive, segregated society in which they live. Flying the kite with both white and black children, together they revel in its flight. Manny feels a strong urge to let the tiger kite go, to be truly free. However, at the urging of his family, he pulls it back to earth. In the process, it catches on a wire and is destroyed. The young boy is angered by the loss and returns home utterly alone, his symbol of freedom destroyed. Her second short story, The Miracle and Arva Topper, published the following year, drew on her own experiences growing up in rural California. This story demonstrates her fruitful imagination and vividly descriptive writing style. In it, Arva Topper, A young, visually impaired, awkward third-grade girl is treated as an outcast by her peers. However, a fellow student who serves as the story's narrator stands up to the bullies. Iola accurately portrays the poverty of the Depression in describing the peculiar gait Arva had developed as a result of the gunny sacks and newspapers her family used to keep her feet dry and warm. The Topper family invites the protagonist to attend a revival prayer meeting at which little Arva becomes the subject of the revivalists' healing efforts. Appearing to go into a trance, she throws off her glasses and swoons into the minister's arms, at which point the narrator thinks she has died. He is very upset and runs out to cry in the back seat of the Topper's old car. When Mr. and Mrs. Topper bring Arva out to the car later, the narrator is amazed that she is alive and also that she seems stronger. "I was healed," she says, staring at him with her one good eye. These portrayals of poverty and isolation, and the sting of being ridiculed as the other, mark the beginnings of Iola's explorations into social justice. The stories were informed by her own observations and experiences growing up in the midst of the Depression. She continued to explore these topics nearly a decade later in The Real Ambassadors. Iola and Dave had first met in 1940 while students at College of the Pacific in Stockton. He was 3 years older, but their paths crossed when he was selected as accompanist for the school's Friday afternoon live radio broadcast, a variety show that was being produced and directed by Iola. After only a few dates, they realized they were falling in love. Less than a year later, Dave graduated and enlisted in the U.S. Army. He got a 3-day pass in September 1941, and the couple eloped to Reno, Nevada. During the early years of their marriage, Dave was assigned to Camp Hahn near Riverside, California, and Iola joined him there for a time, interrupting her studies. She got a job working at the local radio station, first writing news and advertising copy, and eventually serving as what today would be termed music director, preparing the playlists of songs aired by the disc jockeys. This experience helped to broaden her appreciation and knowledge of the jazz genre. In 1944, Dave served in the European theater, first as a rifleman in Patton's Third Army and then leading an integrated jazz band dubbed the Wolfpack, entertaining troops throughout France and Germany as Allied troops occupied more German territory through 1944 and 1945. Once Dave shipped out, Iola returned to Pacific to complete her studies. Private Brubeck returned home in 1946 and began studies in composition on the GI Bill with Darius Milhaud, the lauded French composer who had taken up residence at Mills College to escape persecution during the German occupation of France in 1940. The first performance outlet for the experimental compositions Dave and his fellow Milhaud classmates were writing became known as the Dave Brubeck Octet, which included Paul Desmond on saxophone and Cal Tjader on drums. Brubeck first met Desmond in the military, and after the war, he played regularly with Brubeck and his octet. The group's avant-garde sound limited engagements to colleges with strong music programs. Gigs were few and far between for the experimental ensemble, so Brubeck assembled a trio, with Cal Tjader playing drums and vibes and Ron Crotty on bass. The trio played both jazz standards as well as popular dance music that had broader appeal, generating income that helped support Brubeck's growing family. Throughout the late 1940s, as Brubeck tried to get more work with his trio, his path often crossed with that of Desmond, who unfortunately ended up stealing a number of gigs from Brubeck, which did little to strengthen their relationship offstage. Things were looking glum, as Dave was hoping to support his family of 4 on $42 a week, $450 in 2021 currency, playing long sets 5 nights a week at a bar in rural California, before he finally got his break. Jazz DJ James L. Jimmy Lyons debuted the Dave Brubeck Trio's early recording of Indiana on the Coronet label on San Francisco's KNBC radio in 1949. The listener response was strong. Lyons then invited Brubeck's trio to perform on the air weekly. As a result of this exposure, Brubeck began to land better and better gigs around Northern California. "You need somebody like Jimmy when you're unknown and struggling," Dave Brubeck remembered. Lyons was not only instrumental in helping to launch the career of Dave Brubeck, he also was the first West Coast DJ to spin records by Dizzy Gillespie, Milt Jackson, and Miles Davis. With the help of additional airplay and the backing of Lyons, the trio was soon playing at other better-known San Francisco Bay Area night spots, first at Oakland's Burma Lounge and eventually moving up to the more prestigious Blackhawk and the Cellar in San Francisco. Unknown to many who only were introduced to Dave Brubeck's music in the mid-1950s when he joined Columbia Records, Brubeck's inventive musical approach was the key to his popularity. Jazz historian Ted Gioia states, "By the start of the 1950s, word had begun to circulate of an exceptional young jazz pianist who was applying contemporary compositional techniques to jazz music. Brubeck was then leading a trio which, although it was as unconventional as his earlier octet, caught the ear of the general public as he built his early repertoire using well-known pop tunes, such as Stardust and Indiana. Using devices that would become standard Brubeck approaches over his career, including polytonality, polyrhythms, unexpected key changes, and thunderous block chords that echoed the contemporary classical composers he admired, Brubeck used melodies and chord changes that everyday listeners were familiar with as a jumping-off point. Gioia concludes that this was what made his music sound fresh and exciting. This strange modern mixture, half Tin Pan Alley and half progressive classical music, would become a Brubeck hallmark. Lyons' radio show, dubbed Lyons Busy, went out via the powerful KNBC Clear Channel broadcast and was heard throughout the West. San Francisco Examiner music critic Philip L. Wood explained the significance of the radio exposure. The show generated an astonishingly large Brubeck following not only in California but also in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Utah, and Nevada. These were the young people who bought the first Brubeck 78s. These were the college students who packed auditoriums on his first tours. In summer 1951, with prospects and cash flow starting to improve, Brubeck decided to let bygones be bygones and invited alto saxophonist Paul Desmond to join his group. Desmond was a highly gifted player who proved to be Brubeck's perfect musical partner, and their improvisations were like intimate conversations that revealed a close relationship, both musical and personal. The interplay on their live and studio recordings is a masterclass in listening and improvisation. The sax player became a fixture in the group and a regular at the Brubecks' home, referred to by the Brubeck children as Uncle Paul. With Desmond's often understated and refined sound, lyricism, and instantly recognizable tone, the Dave Brubeck Quartet became one of the most notable proponents of what jazz critics dubbed West Coast jazz, to differentiate it from the harder, driving bebop sounds of Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. From 1952 to 1964, the Dave Brubeck Quartet regularly appeared at San Francisco's Blackhawk Club. According to Elwood, it was the center for modern jazz in the region by 1952, and the Brubeck Quartet, following in the footsteps of the trio, used it as a home base. There was seldom a month during this period that the Brubeck Quartet didn't put in a few nights at the Blackhawk. They even did some recordings there. In her role as de facto manager for the group, in 1953, Iola conceived and executed a letter-writing campaign to colleges up and down the West Coast, offering the quartet's services for a sit-down listening concert. I went to the Oakland Public Library and, using the various telephone directories there, wrote down the mailing addresses of every college from Seattle to San Francisco and sent them a letter, she recalled. This effort was one of the first in an ongoing series of initiatives and strategies that were to have a dramatic impact on her husband's career. Iola Brubeck displayed sharp business acumen and offered frank assessments of the group's prospects over the length of Dave's career. Within each letter, Iola included reviews of some of the group's successful college concerts as evidence of its positive reception. She incentivized the concerts by offering student body groups a share of the proceeds. Dave remembered, some of the colleges answered back, and this led to our first real tour. We drove up to the University of Washington, University of Idaho, and others. This innovative strategy proved very successful and led to a measured growth in the band's earnings. Jazz critic Doug Ramsey argued,
Sample complete. Ready to continue?